He had a train ticket he never used, a suit with every tag removed, and a code no one has ever broken. And still, nobody knows his name. In the summer of 1948, on a quiet stretch of coastline south of Adelaide, Australia, an evening walk turned into one of the country's most enduring mysteries. He wasn't lying there alone for long before anyone noticed him. Earlier that evening, other beachgoers had already spotted a man in the same spot against the seawall. One recalled seeing him raise an arm and let it fall back to the sand, a small, involuntary movement, easy enough to write off as a drunk man shifting in his sleep. On November 30th, a jeweler and his wife noticed the same well-dressed man lying on the sand near the seawall. He was propped against the rocks, one arm stretched oddly above his head. They assumed he'd had too much to drink, or had simply fallen asleep in the warm evening air. It wasn't unusual for the beach, and they walked on. By the next morning, he hadn't moved. When police arrived, they found a man in his 40s, dressed in a suit, carrying no wallet, no identification, and showing no obvious sign of violence. Every tag had been removed from his clothing. Not torn off, removed, carefully, as if someone hadn't wanted him traced. In his pockets, cigarettes, a half-used pack of chewing gum, a used bus ticket, and an unused train ticket. Nothing that could say who he was. He was a fit-looking man in his 40s, with an athletic build. His shoes were freshly polished, an odd detail for someone who, by the state of his clothing, appeared to have been in that same spot for some time. Nothing suggested a struggle, a robbery, or a fall. He looked, more than anything, like a man who had simply lain down and stopped. The case would become known as the Somerton Man, and more than 75 years later, it remains one of the most examined unsolved cases in the world. Police circulated his photograph nationwide. No one came forward to claim him. His fingerprints matched no criminal record in the country, and his dental records matched no one on file. A coroner examined the body and found no obvious wound, no sign of a struggle. Yet the medical experts who testified agreed on one point: this had not been a natural death. Poisoning was suspected, but standard toxicology tests couldn't identify what, if anything, had been used. Whatever caused his death left almost no trace behind, which is itself unusual. Most common poisons of the era were detectable. This one, if it was poison at all, wasn't. A pharmacology professor testified that a small number of rare toxic compounds could kill in tiny oral doses and leave almost nothing behind for a pathologist to find, even one who knew exactly what to look for. The coroner went further, concluding on the record that the death had not been natural and that poison was the likely cause, though he could not say whether the man had taken it himself or been given it by someone else. A month later, police found a suitcase they believed was his, left behind in a railway station cloakroom. Inside, basic tailoring tools, a knife, scissors, a stencil brush, and clothing, some pieces stamped with a name that led nowhere. A tailor examining the garments concluded they'd likely been made in the United States, suggesting the man may not have been Australian at all, or had at least spent time abroad. And just like the suit on the beach, nearly every tag on the suitcase's contents had been carefully cut away. But one detail stood out. A spool of thread inside matched the unusual orange stitching used to mend the dead man's clothes, about as close to a signature as investigators would get. No wallet, no papers, no note. Only a man who appeared to have prepared, deliberately, to disappear without a name, and very nearly succeeded. For months, the case went nowhere. Then, in the spring of 1949, investigators found something that had been missed entirely, sewn into a hidden pocket inside the man's trousers. A pocket most people wouldn't even know existed, meant for a small pocket watch, was a tightly rolled scrap of paper. Printed on it, in an elegant foreign typeface, were two words. A newspaper reporter recognized the phrase. It came from the final page of a centuries-old work of Persian poetry, immensely popular in English translation. A meditation on living fully, without regret, in the face of death. Police appealed to the public. Had anyone lost a copy with that exact page torn out? Someone had. A man came forward with a book he said he'd found discarded in the back seat of his unlocked car, parked, by strange coincidence, on the very night the body was found. The torn edge matched perfectly. This was the book, but the real mystery was on the inside back cover. Faint indentations, pressed into the paper by a pen once used on a page now missing, revealed hidden handwriting. Investigators could just make out a local telephone number, and beneath it, 5 lines of scrambled letters, arranged like a code. No one has ever definitively broken it. The letters were sent to Australia's top naval codebreaker, Captain Eric Nave, who studied the pattern and concluded it probably wasn't a cipher in the traditional sense at all. More likely an acrostic, the first letters of the words in some longer, half-remembered phrase or poem. Even that educated guess never led anywhere close to an answer. The phone number led to a young nurse who lived less than a kilometre from where the body was found. When shown a cast of the dead man's face, she reacted with visible unease, but denied knowing him. She gave police another name, a man she'd once given an identical copy of the same book years earlier during the war. For a moment, it seemed the case might finally be solved. Police tracked him down. He was alive. And his copy of the book was completely intact. The final page, with the words "Tamam Shud," still exactly where it belonged. It wasn't him. The man on the beach remained as unidentified as ever. For decades, the code went unsolved, and the man's identity went with it. Theories multiplied. Some believed he was a Cold War spy, silenced for what he knew. Adelaide sat within reach of 2 sites that mattered to intelligence services at the time: the Woomera rocket testing range and the Radium Hill uranium mine. And his death came just as Australia was standing up its first counter-espionage agency, in the same stretch of years that intercepted Soviet cables would later expose a real spy network operating in the country. None of that proved anything, but it was enough to keep the theory alive for decades. Others thought he'd been a jilted lover, killed by someone close to the nurse who'd reacted so strangely to his face. A few pointed to his unusually developed calf muscles, noted at autopsy, and floated the idea he'd once been a professional dancer. None of it could ever be proven, and each theory eventually ran into the same wall. No name, no records, and no witness willing or able to fill in the gaps. The nurse questioned in 1949 lived out the rest of her life without ever publicly explaining her reaction to that plaster cast. She died decades later. Whatever she may have known left unspoken. One more thread of the story that went quiet before it could be followed. That plaster cast, the same one shown to the nurse back in 1949, hadn't come from nowhere. Unwilling to let the case go cold without a trace of the man himself, police made an unusual decision before his burial. They had the body embalmed and took a plaster cast of his head and shoulders, a physical record, in case science ever caught up to the mystery. It would sit largely forgotten for more than 70 years, until science finally did. In 2011, a University of Adelaide physicist named Derek Abbott gained access to a handful of hairs still trapped in the plaster of that old cast, the only trace of the man's DNA known to exist. It would take another decade of research and a legal battle for permission to exhume the grave itself in 2019, before any answer arrived. In July 2022, Abbott and American forensic genealogist Colleen Fitzpatrick announced a breakthrough. By comparing the recovered DNA against public genealogy databases, they said they had traced a family tree pointing to one man, Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer born in Melbourne in 1905, who had vanished from public records years before his presumed death. It was, they said, no spy, no dancer, no secret agent, just an ordinary man who ended up unidentified on a beach in Adelaide. But here is what has never been confirmed. South Australian police have never officially verified the identification. The exact cause of death remains undetermined, and the code hidden in the back of that book, the 5 scrambled lines that started it all, has never been definitively solved, despite decades of attempts by cryptographers, code breakers, and obsessive amateurs around the world. Even the name itself raises new questions it can't answer. If this was Carl Webb, why did he carry no identification? Why were his clothing tags removed? And why, in the years before his death, had he vanished so completely from the ordinary paper trail of a life, work records, addresses, correspondences, that finding him took DNA and 3/4 of a century? 74 years after a couple mistook a dying man for someone sleeping off a long night, the Somerton Man may finally have a name. He still doesn't have an ending.